So, chapter 13, we just began the chapter last week. And this chapter started off by telling us that it was the question of who's the judge. That's what we started with, because the Gemara tells us that the definition of a tzaddik is somebody who is judged completely by the Yetzer Tov, by the positive inclination. The definition of a rasha, of a wicked person, is that they are judged completely by the Yetzer Hara, by the negative inclination. And the beinoni is somebody that's zeh ve'zeh shoftan, that has both judges. Now, it's really important. The language we learned last week was very important because the word is judge, not control. In other words, we're not suggesting for one moment that in the beinoni's reality, that the Yetzer Hara, the negative inclination, has any control at all. So let's go back. We're focused on trying to understand what a beinoni is. And the reason we're so focused on that is because as we go further through Tanya, so it becomes clearer that the goal is to try to become a beinoni. That's the goal. Okay? Now, it's very difficult to have a goal if you're not quite sure what the goal entails. You know what they say? If you don't know where you're going, you'll land up somewhere else. So if you don't have a goal, it's unlikely that you can achieve what the goal is supposed to achieve. So we need to understand, what is this entity, what is this being, what is this status called the beinoni, before we can talk about how you get there. So that's where we are now. We've spent a lot of time in the preceding chapters just giving some context and the understanding of how the neshama operates and the different faculties that we have. The fact that we deal with two souls. There's what we call the godly soul, there's what we call the animal soul. They're at loggerheads, they're pulling in two different directions. The godly soul wants us to transcend the here and now and to be able to connect to Hashem. The animal soul wants us really just to look after ourselves and eat, drink, and be merry, that kind of an experience. So they're pulling in different directions. We've also learned that a tzaddik has reached a point where the negative processes don't happen. In other words, normal people, if you could use that expression, normal people, you know what normal people means? We all think we're normal people. That's what it means. Anybody who's not like us is a little bit mashuga. Normal people, we have inappropriate thoughts, we do things we're not supposed to do, and we say things that we're not supposed to say. Sometimes we do better, sometimes we don't do so well. So we've learned that a tzaddik doesn't have any of that stuff, doesn't have any of those issues. A tzaddik does not even have the temptation to do, say, or think something which is inappropriate. What's a rasha? You've got to be very careful. You see, when you have a Sephardi in the room, you have to be very careful when you use the word rasha. So what's a rasha? Right, everybody translates a rasha as a wicked person. What we discover is that actually the definition of a rasha is somebody who at some point is not doing what Hashem wants. And until they repair that, they are a rasha. That's just how it works. That's the definition. A rasha doesn't mean that you're a rogue, that you're some kind of a horrible person. A rasha just simply means that at this particular point in time, you're not doing what Hashem wants. And the beinoni is the big question mark. What exactly is a beinoni? Because the beinoni is neither a tzaddik who has absolute mastery, nor is the beinoni a rasha who is susceptible to inappropriate behaviors and thoughts of speech, etc., etc. So what is a beinoni? That's what we're trying to understand. If this is what we're supposed to aspire towards, then it's really important for us to understand. And so, last week, we learned that the beinoni is living with two judges. Let's understand what that means. Let's say that a person, hypothetically, made a commitment to go to a Tanya shiur. Hypothetically. Now comes the evening of the Tanya shiur. How many voices do we have in our minds when it's time to go to the shiur? You have two voices. The one voice says, I made a commitment and I said I'm going to do this and it's really valuable and it's really important, so I need to go to the shiur. And the other voice says, if I would have known when I made this commitment how tired I was going to be, because it's already Wednesday. Understand? The week has already drained my kishkas. So if I had known how tired I was going to be, I would never have committed to this. It was a bad choice. So maybe I'll just sit it out this week, and next week will be better. And then next week I'll go to the shir. Now, as we all well know, anything that you defer to next week doesn't get better. That's just how things are. So those two voices, which one is in control? That's the question. Which of those two voices is in control? This is a no-brainer. You're sitting in the shir. That means that the voice that said come had control. If you were not at the shir, the voice that said go to the shir would not have had, would not have taken control. You wouldn't be here. So that means that in our experience, sometimes it's the so-called good voice that gets to take control, and sometimes it's the not so good voice that gets to take control. Is that fair? Sometimes I do what I'm supposed to do, and sometimes I don't do what I'm supposed to do. That is the definition of having one side of the perspective take control of my circumstance, my reality. So what we learned last week is that's the difference between a moshel, which is a controller, a dictator, if you want to use a very direct translation, versus a shofet, which is a judge. So last week we learned that in the Jewish legal system, that means the halakhic legal system, not the Jewish legal system just because it happens to be in the country of Israel. The halakhic legal system is, Yaakov, how many judges do you have in a court? In a Jewish court? 71 is the highest court, the Sanhedrin, and the smallest court that you could possibly have was 3 judges. Huh? That's what I'm saying. That's why we brought him, because he has all the information. So 3 judges is the minimum to be able to have a court. Why 3 judges? So that no judge will have control. There's no one individual who could determine the outcome of the case on their own. That's why you have 3 judges. This judge says his view. That judge says his view. Now, because it's an odd number, the whole objective is to get a majority vote. That means that the 3rd judge to share a view, which will always be the most senior judge, because you start from the junior and then you work your way up, that's the person who's going to determine the outcome of the case. That person is going to lend their weight either to one judge or to the other judge, and that's going to determine how the case lands. So, how much power does a single judge have in Judaism? Nothing. Nothing. They don't have power. They have, at best, the power of suggestion. They can put forward an argument, and if that argument is sound, and it follows the principles of Judaism, and it's halachically compliant, and it is compelling, then, yes, that judge has something to share. Okay, very good point. There's a lot of pressure on the 3rd judge. That's true, right? It's an interesting comment that there's a lot of pressure on the 3rd judge. Yeah, okay, fair enough, but that's why that person is a senior judge, because they obviously have the broad shoulders to be able to take it on. And as you'll see in a moment, the way we're going to translate that into the experience of the beinoni, you don't have to worry about the responsibility of the 3rd judge. But the point is that when we say that the beinoni has 2 judges, the Yetzer Tov is a judge and the Yetzer Hara is a judge, that's exactly what we're saying. Each one of them proposes their perspective on how this case should be dealt with. So should you come to the shir? The Yetzer Tov says, yes, of course. How could you possibly think otherwise? This is a Tanya shir. How could you not come to the shir? It's like a no-brainer. The Yetzer Hara says, yes, but I have another proposal to make, and that is you have to consider the reality that you have to deal with as an individual, the things that are going on in your life. Maybe you're ADD, maybe you're overtired, maybe all these various things. So what do you think? The Yetzer Hara gets up and says, don't go to the shir. The Yetzer Hara is not an idiot, even though the Gemara calls him a fool, by the way. The Gemara calls the Yetzer Hara the old foolish king. But that doesn't mean he's a complete idiot. He's not going to get up and say, don't do what a Jewish person is supposed to do, because he'd say that's rubbish. So what does the Yetzer Hara do? It comes with a whole elaborate explanation. I'm thinking about your well-being. I really care about you. It's very important. You don't want to create too much stress for yourself. You don't want to overwork yourself. What if you're going to do, etc., etc. So that's another judge. Now the question is, who is the 3rd judge in the beinoni's experience? Now we touched on this last week. And various people put forward different suggestions, and eventually we landed on what was the correct suggestion, that the third judge is Hashem. And that's where we're going to start our journey this evening. We're going to talk about two things, please God, this evening. We're going to talk about the fact that Hashem is the third judge in the beinoni's experience, and we're also going to address a question that was raised in the first chapter. So now you're going to turn around and say, what if I wasn't here in the first chapter? So I'm going to be out of my depth, don't worry. We'll explore it, we'll understand what that question was, and now we're going to address it for the first time. Okay, so let's take a look. If you have the Tanya, it's page 54, almost exactly halfway down the page. And the words we are starting with are, it's the first word on the line, which is where we're going to begin. Ve'halocha kedivrei amachria. Do you see that? Ve'halocha, I didn't count exactly how many words, but it's almost exactly halfway down the page. Ve'halocha kedivrei amachria, which is exactly the principle that we've just spoken about. And that is that the final ruling is going to follow the machria. Machria means the third voice, which is going to sway the judgment to a majority. Again, there are three judges. So if I have one opinion versus one opinion, so as soon as the third judge takes a side, now there is machria. He kind of weighs it in the direction of whichever particular side is supported. So let's have a look. Hu HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Who is the third judge in the circumstance of the beinoni? It is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God Himself. Ha'oizroi le hayetza tov, where Hashem, so to speak, interferes in the system and assists the positive inclination, the Yetzer Tov. K'maimer Azal, as the verse says, sorry, not the verse, as the saying of our sages in the Gemara, Ilemole HaKadosh Baruch Hu oizroi ein yochol loi. Okay, so what is the Gemara? I'll give you the full Gemara. The Gemara says like this: every single day, a person's Yetzer Hara rises up against them and attempts to kill them. That's what the Gemara says. That's a bit of a different reframing of the Yetzer Hara. Everybody thinks the Yetzer Hara is my friend. That's the part of me that cares about me. The rabbis don't care about me. The Yetzer Hara cares about me. The rabbis just pushing me all the time to do more and do more. And the Yetzer Hara is the only one who cares that I should get enough sleep, that I should eat well, that I should entertain myself, that I should, Comes along the Gemara, and the Gemara says, every single day, the Yetzer Hara rises up against a person to kill them. Okay, do you think that that's maybe a little bit of a dramatic statement? When last did you have an experience where you thought that your Yetzer Hara was trying to kill you? Well, the rabbis are obviously surely stretching the point to make the point. Well, what do you think it means to kill? Spiritually, right? Spiritually kill. What does that mean? See, that was the easy answer. The easy answer is for everybody to say that it means to spiritually kill it. Okay, good. What does that mean? What does it mean to spiritually die? To get cut off from Hashem, right? What does it mean to get cut off from Hashem? What do you say?
Disconnect from Hashem.
Disconnect. What does it mean? What does it mean? Tachlis. Practically. What does it look like? What does it feel like? How do you know it's happened? What does it mean?
Physicality.
What do you mean?
Physical person only.
So you're saying that, that's a good point, that what does it mean to be cut off from Hashem, where a person becomes physical, and that's where it starts and ends. So let me ask you a question. Is that possible? Is it possible that a person should become completely physical with no sense, and this is not rhetorical, I'm curious, is it possible that a person could become so invested in physicality that they lose sight of their spiritual side? They lose sight of their neshama. Can that happen?
Sure. Yeah.
Can happen, yes? Can happen. Okay. So let's take this a step further. We know, and we say it in various places, we say it in our davening, we just had it in the Torah reading a few weeks ago. We understand that life, from a Jewish perspective, is not simply a measure. Oh, there you go. So Gary's made a good point. Well, actually, both the Garys made a good point, right? To be like an animal. I'm going to come back to that in a second. I'm very pleased that you said that. Right? To be like an animal. We're going to come back to that. So we say in various places, we say, Ki heim chayenu v'oirech yomenu. We say in Ma'ariv, For they, the Torah and the mitzvahs, are chayenu. That's our life. What do we say in the parasha a couple of weeks ago? And we read it when we take out the Torah. We say, Ve'atem hadveikim ba'Hashem Elokeichem, you who cleave to Hashem your God, chayim kulchem hayom, you are alive today. For us as Jewish people, the definition of being alive is not purely that you could take your pulse. That's not where it begins and ends. And that's why Gary's point is a good point about being like an animal. But we're going to test that in a second. Is an animal alive? Of course an animal's alive. Is an animal connected to Hashem? No?
On some level.
On some level? On what level?
I'm not an animal.
It's a good question, right? So let's look at this for 1 second. Let's just look at this for 1 second. What is the animal or creature that you like the least? Snake. What? Cockroach. What else? I'm not saying that for the recording. What? Come on. Nobody's going to say mosquito.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, it's just because we're not yet in the season. Give it a few more weeks and everybody will remember that mosquitoes are the worst creatures. Now let me ask you this. Is a mosquito a tzaddik or a rasha in animal terms? In creature terms? Is a mosquito a tzaddik or a rasha or a beinoni? In creature terms, obviously not in human terms. A tzaddik. Why a tzaddik? Because the mosquito is doing exactly what Hashem wants it to do. You don't like it, that's your business. But from the mosquito's point of view, if there is a mosquito Gan Eden, they're all going. And we just pray, of course, that their Gan Eden is nowhere near our Gan Eden. But if there's a mosquito Gan Eden, they're all going because they're all doing exactly what Hashem wants. There is no mosquito who turns around and says, you know what? Hashem does. I'm sick and tired of being a pest that everybody hates. That's it. I'm rebelling against Hashem. I'm no longer sucking blood. There's no such concept. Cannot happen. Which, by the way, explains a different Gemara, and will come up again later on in Tanya, where the Gemara says the reason that when Hashem created the world, He created humans last, is so that if a human becomes arrogant, then we'll remind them the mosquito was created before you. And that's not just chronology. That means the mosquito is higher up on the pecking order because it's doing what it's supposed to, and you might not be doing what you're supposed to. The mosquito is 100% aligned with God's mission, and we're not. So, to say that a person is like an animal when they're not alive is actually not it's not the correct perspective. Maybe being like an animal is not a bad thing. So we have to clarify. It's good to be like an animal if you're an animal. That's an important piece of clarification. There's nothing wrong with being an animal if you're an animal. But it's a terrible tragedy to be like an animal if you're a human. That's terrible. So what does it mean for a person to be alive versus what does it mean for a person to be dead? Well, one of the intriguing principles of Judaism is that a person who is a rasha is considered dead even while they are alive. So it gives a whole different meaning to the walking dead. And a tzaddik is alive even after they pass away. Because our definition of alive is not taking the pulse. Let's take this a step deeper. Okay, let's take it a step deeper. So, for example, let's say we're sitting in a room right now. In this room, every one of us is enjoying the benefit of a piece of plastic. Yes? What piece of plastic?
Chair.
The chair that we're sitting on. The chair that we're sitting on. We're enjoying the benefit of a piece of plastic. So how come you don't walk in over here and say, can I please have a piece of plastic? You come in and say, can you please pass me a chair? Why? Well, why do we speak that way? I'll give you a different example of the same principle. Same principle. Let's say that you went to somebody for Shabbos, and they are this unbelievable cook. So, somebody was telling me today that they've got, this could actually be a fun community event, by the way. They've got a whole group of friends, and they've been doing every week for 4 or 5 weeks their own come dine with me. So you go to your friends, and it's like a theme, and it's become very competitive, whatever. I don't know if they're all going to be friends by the end of it. So you come into somebody's house, and they've made some kind of elaborate dish that has some unpronounceable name, right? But ultimately, what's it made out of? Let's just say, for argument's sake, it's made out of cauliflower. But they've turned it into who knows what, with all kinds of infusions and spices and who knows, whatever. And it's this very, very upscale dish. And you say, pass the cauliflower. They're going to be offended. This is not cauliflower. This is blah, 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 whatever, Why? What's the difference? What's the difference between identifying the material that something is made out of or the role that it plays? What's the difference? Take it one step further. Once upon a time, Yaakov is before your time. Once upon a time, there was something called a record player. Right? A record player. And how did you know that you had the best of the best record players? What was the chap of the best record players?
Stylus.
The diamond tip stylus, right? That was the big chap. So I happen to know somebody who successfully broke it. Their family, he was a little kid, and he broke it. Okay, how did it happen? Because he needed to climb up somewhere. So he took the record player, and he stood on the record player, and he climbed up. So now the question is this. What's wrong with this picture? When somebody's climbing, when a person takes, I don't know, what's really valuable that a person may have in their house. I don't know. Let's say that a person has a brand new iPad. There you go. Takes a brand new iPad. Use it as a doorstop. What's wrong with the picture? That's where you miss out what the purpose of something is. Right? So exactly. Somebody just said this in the chat. Right? What the material makeup of something versus its purpose. Plastic is what the cherry is made out of. But that disappears when I see the purpose of the chair. I'm no longer looking at it as plastic. I'm looking at it as a chair, something which facilitates, something that gives me value in my life. I'm no longer looking at the iPad as, like some Neanderthal who came along and saw this thing and thought, well, what do you do with it? Maybe you hit an animal over the head. And I realize it's an iPad. It's got some kind of a value. It's got all these apps. It's got all this computing power, whatever the case is. I now see the purpose of something. When you see the purpose of something, it comes alive. When you have something and it has no purpose, it is dead. Now, we don't have to look very far because Baruch Hashem in South Africa, for the last few months, the Baruch Hashem is for the last few months. We haven't been practicing this, but for many, many years, we have practiced the idea of having appliances that don't work because there's no electricity. Right, so you can have the fanciest thing in the world. You got this kind of a fridge, and you got that kind of an oven, and you got this kind of a computer. And if there's no juice, if there's no power, it's all, what do we say? Dead. That's what we say. That's what we say. We say it's dead. Frankly, it's never alive. Even when it's working, it's never alive. But we are able easily to determine that something that is not living its purpose is dead. That's how we define life or death from a Torah perspective, right? Therefore, it is possible for a human being to be alive, fit as a fiddle, triathlete, Iron Man, dead, because they're not living their purpose. Whereas you could have a person who is feeble and weak and, literally can barely move, and they're absolutely alive. Actually, just before coming here, somebody shared a video from a particular chassid, an elderly rabbi. He was also a great Kabbalist. And somebody shared a video that I'd never seen before of him at a wedding. The man is like hunched over. He's an old man. But you look at him and he's so alive. He's got so much energy. I mean, I'm not saying he's dancing, but he's just like got this spunk and this energy because he's truly alive. And you get people, sometimes we don't have it over here, but in other parts of the world, they sit for a good portion of the day riding public transport. And you see all these dead people. They're all just like sitting there, like nobody moves and nobody talks and nobody engages. Every single day, says the Gemara, the Yetzer Hara rises up against us and tries to kill us, meaning tries to suck out the purpose for which we're on this earth. And it's so sophisticated, and it's so elaborate, and it's so good at what it does, that it is possible to convince us that we are living the best life. We could be on the front pages of magazines, we could be in the Fortune 500, we could be with millions of followers on social media, and the Yetzer Hara says that is life, and if it's not our purpose, it's like an appliance that's not plugged in. There's a story that the previous Rebbe tells, and for whatever reason, I've had occasion to share the story 3 times in like 4 days. So it's obviously a sign, that Hashem wants me to share the story for whatever reason, right? So the story goes like this. He calls the story of the lost souls. Usually when you hear that somebody's a lost soul, you think that this is a person who is, disconnected from their Judaism or something like that. The story goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a very wealthy man. In those days, one of the status symbols of wealth was that you had a private chauffeur, which is basically a wagon driver. So this guy would travel on business from place to place, and he had his wagon driver, who happened also to be a Jewish guy, and they would travel together. Usually he'd travel from town to town, doing business, and he'd make sure to get to a decent-sized Jewish community for Shabbos. And they'd often arrive on Friday afternoon. And the protocol was simple. The wagon driver's responsibility is to find a place for the horses, to feed them, and to lock away the wagon so it should be safe. And the wealthy man, being the wealthy man, had the luxury of being able to prepare for Shabbos like a mensch. So he would go and buy some food for Shabbos, and he'd find a hotel room, and he'd go to the mikveh, which in those days was the big bathhouse, and prepare himself for Shabbos. I don't know, maybe he had a sauna, whatever it was. And then he'd have the luxury of being able to arrive at shul before everybody else got there, and he'd sit and he'd learn something, or he would say Shir Hashirim, or he'd read Tehillim, or whatever the case is. And then the poor people would filter into shul before the service began. They'd always be looking for a meal, and wherever he was, he'd invite all of the poor people as they arrived at shul. He'd invite them home for Shabbos, and he'd make a beautiful Shabbos meal for them. One Friday, he arrives in a particular shtetl. As per usual, he parts ways with the wagon driver. The wagon driver's now got to go find the place for the horses, the stables, whatever it is. And he's walking along, and he sees that there's somebody whose wagon is stuck in the mud. Very, very common problem in those days. And if the wagon is stuck in the mud, and it's Friday, and it's getting late, he needs help to be able to get his wagon out of the mud. So the wealthy man figures, you know what? I've watched my wagon driver do this a few times. Maybe I also know how to do it. Which, by the way, is kind of the equivalent of Jewish men watching a YouTube video and thinking that they know DIY. And all you got to do is the next day when you call the handyman, it's going to cost extra because he's also got to undo what you officially did. So here's a guy, who's seen 1 or 2 times. He thinks he knows how to do it. So he goes and he starts helping them to push this wagon out of the mud, and he is absolutely clueless. So as he's pushing the wagon, so he loses his footing and he slips into the mud, and now he's covered in mud from top to toe. And a short version of the story, he's completely useless, and he doesn't help them at all. All he does is delays himself getting ready for Shabbos. And in fact, by the time he gets to the mikveh, it's already closed. And now he arrives at Shabbos. He doesn't have food. He doesn't have clean clothing. He's full of mud. He looks like a schlepper. Meanwhile, Dafka, that Friday, the wagon driver was very efficient. He was able to quickly find a stable and feed the horses, lock up the wagon, and he had spare time in his hands. So he thought, I have some spare time. I'll go get some food for Shabbos. And I'll go to the mikveh, and I'll go to the shul early. And he gets to the shul early. He's very surprised that the wealthy man is not there. He sees the poor people coming in. So he figures, you know what, I'll invite them over for Shabbos. So now the wealthy man, who now looks like a beggar, lands up having Shabbos all by himself. And the wagon driver has all these guests. The only problem is he's never hosted a Shabbos in his life. He has no idea what he's supposed to do. That's like like the dog that catches the car, Now what? So it's a disaster. He doesn't know how to sing the Shabbos songs, and he doesn't know how to engage socially with the people. So they don't have a good time, and he doesn't have a good time, and the wealthy man doesn't have a good time. Anyway, after 120 years, they each pass away. They come up to Shamayim, and they do a whole assessment. And they say, you know what, pretty much you were good guys. You're aligned with what you're supposed to do. And we're ready to allow you into Gan Eden. There's only one problem. There's one Shabbos that neither of you did properly. You got your lines crossed. So unfortunately, you're going to have to go back and redo a Shabbos because you messed it up. Because you weren't living your purpose. It's not the purpose of a wealthy man who knows nothing about wagons to try and schlep a wagon out of the mud. It's a big mitzvah to help somebody who's stuck, absolutely. But it doesn't mean it's your mitzvah. So if a person doesn't live with purpose, that is dead. That's what we're talking about over here. Every single morning, the Yetzer Hara gets up and says, what could I do to distract you from living your purpose? And it will be very meaningful, and it will be very attractive, and it will be very spiritual, and it will be very important, but it won't be your purpose. That is the key factor that the Yetzer Hara works on. Now, the question is this: how do you see past the Yetzer Hara's attempts? How do we have the objectivity to recognize what we're really supposed to be doing? What's really our purpose? If somebody had to ask us, what is our purpose? Would we have a ready answer? If we're facing a dilemma, not a dilemma between good and bad, but a dilemma between that good and that good, helping a person with a wagon or inviting guests for Shabbos, they're both positive things. Would we have the objectivity to know what our purpose is? Would we? I don't know. I think it's fair to assume that very, very often we'll get it wrong. And we'll believe that we're doing something which is so pious and so holy and so important and so whatever. And we'll get it wrong. Just like those two guys. They all thought they were saving the world. The wagon driver thought he was saving the poor people. And the wealthy man thought he was saving the people with a stuck wagon. And both of them were destroying everything. So how do you have that clarity? Says the Gemara. What? Torah. So, the problem with Torah is it's not like those things in case of emergency break glass. You've got to have the Torah already in the system. You know what I mean? You can't go scrabbling quickly and do a Google search for what does the Torah say about the following dilemma. You've got to have it entrenched. So that's why the Gemara continues. That every single day the Yetzer Hara rises up against us to try, God forbid, to kill us. And here comes the quote that's in the Tanya. Ve'ile mole hakadosh baruch hu oizroi. Were it not for the fact that Hashem helps the person, lo yochol loi, the person could never overcome the Yetzer Hara. It's a very humbling perspective, because that essentially means none of us is so brilliant and so focused and so on the mark and so capable that we can actually work this out on our own. We have to have the humility to recognize you actually need Hashem's help. And that will influence not only learning Torah, but also to daven that Hashem should help us. Like we do every single morning. We say it every single morning. Do not bring us to a case of being tested. Do not bring us to a case where we're ashamed. Do not bring us to a situation where the Yetzer Hara takes control. We ask Hashem for assistance every single day. Why? Because we have to be humble enough to realize that we cannot do it on our own. We need divine backup. That's what we need. We need divine backup. And by the way, the Gemara over there bases this on a verse in Tehillim, that the verse in Tehillim says, that the wicked one looks out at the tzaddik and hopes or tries to kill him, and Hashem lo yazvenu biyodoi, Hashem does not leave the person totally vulnerable to the hand of this Rasha. So that's the source of this principle, which is Hashem has to help us. Now let's plug that back into the beinoni. The beinoni is maybe not living with such drastic, dramatic issues as we are. But the beinoni does have two voices, two judges. So who's going to sway it? Hashem. That's, in a sense, if you wish, the beinoni's superpower is that the beinoni has done so much personal work that they now deserve to have Hashem as their backstop at any given time. So let's read back inside. So what is it? How does Hashem help us? Okay, it's all very well to say that Hashem's going to help the beinoni. Okay, very nice. What's the technique? What does Hashem do? Does Hashem send down a memo to say, take the red pill? You know, how does it work? Well, what does he do? So he continues, the assistance that Hashem gives us is it's a little turbo boost of divine energy or perspective that gets fed into the neshama. It's like almost like an intravenous neshama boost. And that boost allows the person to have that edge, that perspective, that clarity that can override the foolishness, the idiocy, the insanity of the Yetzer Hara, like the advantage of light over darkness, something which we've mentioned briefly before, and we'll mention in a lot more detail in the coming chapters, this principle of how light overwhelms darkness. But the point is, effectively, let's understand the dynamic of our own neshama. See, the way, I don't know what picture you have in your mind right now, but you could have a picture in your mind, as maybe some people do, of a bench with three judges. So you got the good judge, the Yetzer Tov. You got the bad judge, the Yetzer Hara. And then you got Hashem with his gavel, and he's saying, order in the court. We're not listening to that guy, we're listening to this guy. Or maybe what you've got is the picture in your mind of the red guy on the one shoulder and a white person on the other shoulder. And the next thing there's like like Hashem whispering in your ear, say, listen to the white voice. You know. But we have to understand the technology of our own neshama to appreciate how this assistance from Hashem actually gets there. In chapter 2, we learnt that the definition of the neshama, otherwise known as the nefesh elokis, the godly soul, is chelek eloika mima'al mamash. That it is a piece of Hashem from on high, literally, which, by the way, in the Hayom Yom, right, when was it yesterday, the day before, the Hayom Yom said that mima'al and mamash are completely contradictory. Mima'al means that the highest possible spiritual, aloof, abstract reality, and mamash means really tangible and, here and now. That's the power of the neshama. The neshama plugs into the highest, and you could feel it in the reality of this world. Which means, what do we mean that the neshama is chelek elokah, that it's a piece of Hashem? So again, I don't know how people visualize a neshama. If you do visualize a neshama, you ever try to visualize a neshama? What do neshamas look like? Piece of jelly. Long or a blob? Okay, a blob of jelly. There you go. I never thought of that one. Okay, what else? What other imagery do you have in your mind of a neshama? What does it look like?
Shiny and see-through.
Shiny and see-through, and what shape?
It's just a bit bigger than me.
Okay, so almost like an aura kind of thing. Yeah. Almost right. Okay, that kind of hugs the features of the person. I think for many people, that's what a neshama looks like. It's like this translucent version of the human. You often see that. I remember there was once an advert for wearing your seatbelt, and the way that they did it was with these like translucent versions of the person that was like floating out of the body, except for the guy wearing the seatbelt. Anyway, so what we don't understand about a neshama is that whatever image you may have of a neshama in your mind, the likelihood is that the image has to fit with the thought that the neshama lives inside me. Right? Neshama shenosata bi tahirahi, as we say in the morning every single day in our davening, the neshama that you have placed within me is pure. But that's not an accurate depiction of the neshama. The neshama lives partly in me and partly beyond me. There's an aspect of the neshama that is internal, and there's an aspect of the neshama that is beyond anything that I could imagine. There's a part of my neshama that's tethered to me, And there's a part of my neshama that's tethered to Hashem, or is actually one with Hashem's essence. Okay? The world in which we live, or the way in which we live in this world, is the resistance. So if you can imagine current. Who's the scientists in the room over here? Okay? So you've got current that's flowing down a wire. You increase the resistance on the circuit. And what happens? The current is less powerful. So for example, if you've got a light and you've got what they call a dimmer, all that's doing is it's creating more resistance on the current. So therefore the light gets dimmer. In order for a neshama to live inside a body, there has to be some kind of spiritual resistance. Otherwise our soul would be too powerful for our body. The body would malfunction. So there's resistors that kind of just, tone down the degree of light or energy that's flowing into our body from our neshama. What does Hashem do for the beinoni? Drops the resistor, increases the current. So now the neshama becomes a little bit more clear. And therefore the choices are more obvious. It's not like Hashem says, pick B, that's the correct answer. It's just that Hashem ramps up the degree of neshama awareness that the beinoni has at that moment. So therefore the beinoni has the clarity to be able to make the correct decision. That's what he calls it. It's the glimmer of divine energy and light that now shines through into this person's neshama and completely opens their eyes to what they should choose. This is the gift of the beinoni. The gift of the beinoni is an individual who has worked so hard on their own self-development, on their own self-control, that now they deserve Hashem interfering with the process to their benefit whenever there's a major dilemma. And that's why, unlike the tzaddik who doesn't have the temptation in the first place, the beinoni has the temptation but doesn't succumb to the temptation because they've got this nudge from Hashem to stay where they should. And that might be one of the most useful insights into what a beinoni is. Not somebody who's perfect, not somebody who's mastered everything, but a person who's achieved enough mastery to deserve Hashem as their backstop, as their, what? Extra help from Hashem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu o Yisrael. That Hashem will help them. Okay, we didn't get to the next part about answering the question we had in chapter 1. That's fine. Please God, we'll do that next week. Which, by the way, I should just note, is Rosh Chodesh Elul. It's a very good time to renew our commitment to our learning.
Wow.